When you get to the Arctic, you normally go there by ship. And when you're standing on the ship and get into the ice, there's a smell which is very peculiar. The smell of cold water and ice. And then when you get away from the ship and you don't hear the ship's engine anymore, you only have natural sounds. You see, the cracking of the ice, the howling of the wind, and maybe your own footsteps. And you hear your own heart beating, which you don't hear in Europe.
Everyone who actually goes there is overwhelmed by it. First of all, it's enormous. Second, it's actually a lot more varied. If you haven't been there, you think, oh, cold. And it's lighter than you think when it's dark. Because there's not necessarily a lot of cloud cover, and you will get starlight, moonlight, and they reflect off white surfaces, which look, of course, blue. So you'll get a kind of shimmering light even when there isn't any sun.
200 years ago, most people could only imagine how the Arctic might be.
I feel a cold northern breeze play upon my cheeks, which braces my nerves and fills me with delight. I try in vain to be persuaded that the pole is the seat of frost and desolation. It ever presents itself to my imagination as a region of beauty and delight. I shall satiate my ardent curiosity with the sight of a part of the world never before visited, and may tread a land never before imprinted by the foot of man.
Mary Shelley wrote at a time when the Europeans had only ventured to the edge of the Arctic Ocean. In the following 2 centuries of exploration, our knowledge and understanding of the region has increased enormously, transforming the way we imagine it. It's become a place where heroes were born, and heroes would disappear without trace. We have discovered that, however remote and forbidding it seems, it is vitally connected to the climate and nature of the rest of our planet. It's been both a theatre of war, where great powers vie for supremacy, but also a cause for international collaboration. Recently, it has become a symbol of the fragility of our planet. And now the way we see the Arctic is being transformed once again. Throughout history, the idea of wilderness has developed from meaning a place of fear and the unknown to a place of beauty, unspoilt by humankind. By any definition, the Arctic once symbolized both these ideas. In our times, wilderness has come to mean something we must protect, something we must save from ourselves. The word Arctic derives from the Greek word Arctos, bear, and wilderness comes from Old Anglo-Saxon, the place of wild beasts. And in the early 1800s, the British Navy planned to conquer it. One image above all inspired the would-be polar explorers of the future. The Navy's greatest hero, Horatio Nelson, was said to have fought a polar bear single-handed at the age of 16.
It was an anecdote told by his commanding officers. It made its way into the Nelson biographies, and certainly many of the polar histories through the 19th century seized upon this episode of the young boy engaging the Arctic. Is there truth to the story? Possibly a mixture of truth and fantasy, myth, but it's a wonderful story.
The polar bear was to become an integral part of the Arctic image.
If you want to think of it as an allegory for man against nature, the bear, emblematic of the Arctic wilderness in its sort of ferocity, certainly for a generation of people reading heroic biographies, it was a story that they cherished.
Young Nelson's Arctic encounter was to be redrawn and republished dozens of times in hagiographies and schoolboy comics right up to the present day.
As a symbol of the Navy against the Arctic, the challenge of the bear personified as the Arctic wilderness, it's an image that was taken right through the century.
The Arctic wasn't only playing on the imagination of schoolboys dreaming of emulating Nelson. John Barrow, second secretary of the Admiralty, was also looking north. The maps of the time show that he had as little idea as Mary Shelley as to what lay beyond the great ice barriers of the north. He did hope to find the fabled Northwest Passage, a short and potentially lucrative route to the great trading emporiums of Asia.
The Northwest Passage was this elusive chalice which had been sought for centuries, and it was a chance for Britain to plant the Union Jack, to claim new lands, to explore, and to in fact have the honor of discovering undiscovered parts of the world.
The Northwest Passage had been a British obsession since the time of Henry VIII. Numerous expeditions had failed in the attempt to find it. Now what spurred John Barrow on was a fear that another nation might get there first.
The Russians have for some time been strongly impressed with an idea of an open passage round America. It would be somewhat mortifying if naval power but of yesterday should complete a discovery in the 19th century, which was so happily commenced by Englishmen in the 16th.
The Navy's first expedition was to produce a new model of naval hero, the Arctic Explorer. First among them was the leader of the expedition, Captain John Ross.
He was vain, he was egotistical, he was a cantankerous Scot devoted to the Arctic, devoted to enhancing his public profile. He was a celebrity hell-bent on utilising the wilderness to self-promote.
Captain Ross's expedition was supplied in naval fashion, all the latest equipment of the day and other essentials, a 25-volume library and 90 religious tracts. Also 129 gallons of gin and brandy, 105 pounds of snuff, and 40 umbrellas.
If you think of Arctic explorations as voyaging to the limits of the known world, these naval voyages in their well-stocked ships were literally sailing to the edges of the map. They took with them all the things that perhaps seem totally unnecessary if you were to travel successfully through the Arctic, but all these things that were deemed necessary for English gentlemen to sustain themselves in a civilised manner within a challenging wilderness.
In June 1818, Ross's two vessels managed to penetrate past Baffin Island into the Davis Strait. It was the first sight that he and many of his crew had had of the Arctic in summer.
It's hardly possible to imagine anything more exquisite, by night as well as by day. They glitter with a vividness of colour beyond the power of art to represent. The weather was beautiful, fine and clear, and nothing could exceed the serenity and at the same time the grandeur of the whole scene around us. The water was glassy smooth, and ships glided gently among the numberless masses of ice. The land of Greenland, rugged and high, and almost entirely covered with snow, filled up the eastern horizon.
The Arctic was a vast geography of nothingness. It was a tempting sublime. It was an imaginary landscape. What could they expect? They travelled with baggage. They travelled with a perceptual baggage. Icebergs that reared from the sea like towers and cathedrals. Midnight polar winter sky with ribbons of the aurora borealis in emeralds and golds and deep crimsons. A beautiful, wondrous, awe-inspiring, sublime place. A sublime place that was terrifying.
Ross and many of the officers in his crew were keen diarists and competent watercolourists. The pictures and accounts of their experiences were to shape the Arctic image in the European mind. They also discovered a new people, an isolated band of Inuit they called the Arctic Highlanders. Until Ross's two naval vessels arrived, they believed themselves to be the only human beings in the world.
What my ancestors have told me is that when the first contacts were made between the Europeans and the Inuit, I think there was a sense of fear in many ways because they had never seen people with the type of skin color that they had. Some of the explorers had blonde hair. They didn't really know where these beings were coming from. So there was a lot of reluctance and hesitation involved in actually going up to someone and making contact.
Ross's voyage, and indeed his reputation, was to be marred by one of the tricks that the Arctic plays on the naive observer. He aborted his expedition after what he perceived to be a range of mountains blocked his route through to the Northwest Passage. He named them the Croker Mountains, after an Admiralty official.
The land I then saw was a high ridge of mountains extending directly across the bottom of the inlet. This chain appeared high in the centre, and those towards the north had at times the appearance of islands being insulated by fog at their bases.
The Arctic was a great place for illusions as well. They're Arctic mirages. They're quite wonderful mirages. They're called Fata Morgana, and they make things look a lot taller than they are. They look very real until you get out your binoculars and you look at them closely and you realize that some of the information is missing. They're shimmering around the edges, and then the next minute, they're gone.
Ross's so-called Croker Mountains were indeed a polar illusion, and not a mountain range. On his return to London, Ross found himself pilloried for his failure. The great cartoonist George Cruikshank ridiculed the collection of Arctic specimens Ross and his officers had brought back. The Arctic and the prospect of a Northwest Passage was to entice and confound John Ross and many subsequent explorers for the rest of the century.
The early British explorers, they really didn't understand the Arctic. People tend to have this concept of the Arctic ice as being like a big skating rink. Certainly the early polar explorers kind of thought that. They figured they could, well, once they get in the ice, they'll just haul off on their sledges and away they go. It's not like that. I mean, the ice is constantly in motion. It piles up into great huge ridges. You see these people, pushing sledges over ridges that are 10 and 20 meters high. And that ridge is extending 30 or 40 meters down into the ocean below it. For a ship to try to break through that is next to impossible.
Though they failed to penetrate the ice barrier, their exploits were celebrated in the popular art and literature of the time, making them national heroes despite huge loss of ships and lives. One expedition above all was to dominate the 19th century culture of the Arctic. Sleeping in my hour I fell asleep. I dreamt a dream, and they thought it true, concerning Franklin and his gallant crew.
John Franklin was a veteran explorer. He was given the command of the Northwest Passage Expedition in 1845, left England full of optimism, his ships full with the latest Victorian gadgetry, but he didn't return. The Franklin saga occupied the minds of a generation of naval men going in search of him over 30 voyages. He's perhaps remembered now as a bumbling old man who was full of all sorts of Victorian ideals and didn't really approach the wilderness in an appropriate manner. I think that's probably a harsh analysis.
Well, the Franklin expedition was one of those things like the Titanic. In fact, there is a great parallel between the way those two stories both came out. Both involved ships, both involved ice, both involved huge fanfare when they set out. State-of-the-art, best we've got, modern technology, no danger, it'll be a snap. Oh, there's never been anything like this before. They had special plating on their hulls, they had steam organs, they had libraries, and best of all, they had tinned food.
The best-equipped expedition to date, with 129 men, disappeared among the frozen islands above the Canadian mainland. Unfortunately, his expedition coincided with a particularly cold sequence of years.
There's nothing else Franklin can be accused of bad timing. You know, he sailed at really one of the coldest periods in 500 years. It was a period where, you know, already very forbidding landscape in terms of the geography. It was like a puzzle. It was like a maze. It was an extremely difficult challenge to begin with.
Usually the pan ice would melt in summers, and for 3 years it didn't. So their ships got in to a place near King William Island, and they couldn't get out again. They were stuck. And when you're beset by the ice, it's not just that you're frozen in as in an ice cube. The ice is actually pushing and being driven up against you so that it piles up. If there's a wind, the sticking out parts of the ice act as sails, and it can move very quickly, and it can move with enormous force.
Quite what happened during the 3 years that Franklin and his 2 ships were iced in is still a mystery.
They had to abandon the ships. Nobody quite knows where those ships are. Had they walked north, they might have been rescued by whalers, because there were a lot of whalers in the summer went there. But they didn't. They walked south, dragging a sledge which contained such things as a copy of The Vicar of Wakefield, just what you would wish to drag on a sledge. Lots of bars of soap, lots of very handy. There was obviously something wrong with their ability to reason at this point. They went in the wrong direction. They took a lot of unnecessary things.
It took 3 years before people in London began to wonder whether anything had gone wrong. Spearheading the Let's Find Franklin lobby was his redoubtable wife, the first heroine of the Arctic story, Lady Jane Franklin.
Amazing celebrity in her own right, this remarkable woman who turned her husband's tragic disappearance into a career. She became this incredible celebrity. She was beautiful. She traveled the world. She certainly made the most of his loss.
Her charisma and exertions were to launch more than 30 Arctic expeditions over the next few decades. Many lasted for years at a time. New landscapes were charted, ships were wrecked, more heroes emerged, more lives were lost. Neither Sir John nor his 2 ships were ever found. Successive search parties returned from the north with handfuls of artifacts, assorted human bones, and a lot of conjecture.
There's a book called Dead Elvis, which is about the posthumous life of Elvis Presley, and it turns out that he's led a much more vigorous, energetic, and varied life since being dead than he did when he was alive. And you could write a book called Dead Franklin, which would follow the life of Franklin after he died. The first phase of that would be Franklin the Mystery. Where has he gone? The second phase, when Lady Jane Franklin really got going, was Franklin the Brave Hero. And she built him up to no end, making him almost like somebody who had died in a war, or had sort of selflessly martyred himself. The fact was that he was setting out to find the Northwest Passage, which was not a war. It was going to be a cheap way of getting to Asia. It was a commercial venture. But nonetheless, brave Franklin, heroic Franklin, got statues in Westminster Abbey and mythology of the very heroic person kind.
Just as money was being raised to commemorate Britain's great Arctic martyr in Westminster Abbey, one of the most intrepid Franklin searchers returned with new evidence. From Lady Franklin's point of view, Dr. John Ray was decidedly off-message.
The bodies of some 30 persons and graves were discovered on the continent. From the mutilated state of many of the bodies and the contents of the kettles, it is evident that our wretched countrymen had been driven to the last dread alternative: cannibalism.
John Ray brought the wrong news. The wrong news was they were eating each other. This was the wrong news. It caused great indignation, both from Lady Jane. Hard to get your husband into Westminster Abbey if he had been practicing that kind of cuisine. And also from Charles Dickens, who wrote a very outraged piece: no honest, virtuous, good, true English sailor would ever, ever, ever eat another honest, good, true, and virtuous English sailor.
The 3 earliest casualties from the expedition have lain buried high up in the Arctic for the last 160 years. Their graves on Beechey Island have remained one of the few tangible symbols of the Franklin disaster. In 1984, some Canadian scientists exhumed their bodies and gave a new breath of life to the Arctic mystery.
To be able to look into the eyes of someone who's been dead for more than a century, not only that, who was a participant in one of the great discovery expeditions, it is a profoundly moving experience. But I think for people who saw that image, who saw that face, this is a face that they know. This could be the face of a family member or a brother or a friend. I think that really opened up a new era of interest in Arctic exploration. You can see that in terms of the number of sort of amateur sleuths who are poking around King William and Beechey Islands every summer.
Forensic analysis drove the Canadians to the conclusion that Franklin's crew had been poisoned by the lead from the tin cans they had stored their food in. Lead poisoning may explain why the remaining crew hauled bars of soap, silver spoons, silk slippers, and a copy of The Vicar of Wakefield across the ice and in the wrong direction. The Canadian theory is hotly disputed and has reopened the Franklin mystery to yet more speculation.
This is one of those historical stories that really is very difficult to answer. It's a story, I suppose, about the ongoing appeal of the Arctic as an imaginative space, the North Pole is an absence of anything, but it's a featureless spot, but at the same time it's that point where scientific curiosity and imaginations combine and continues to capture people's interest.
There was one significant byproduct from 15 years of Franklin search expeditions. Almost the entire coastline and island system above North America was mapped out, showing the region to be almost permanently icebound. By the 1860s, however, after years of sacrifice and failure, the awesome nature of the frozen North seemed to have sapped the strength of British ardour. Edwin Landseer's picture summed up the sentiments of the time.
Landseer's Man Proposes, God Disposes is this wonderful, biting, controversial painting. It's painted in 1864, and people cried when they saw it. The newspaper reports said, gosh, this is too awful to be proper art. It wasn't a patriotic picture, it was a picture exposing the vanity of human effort. There's an echo of cannibalism there too. These ravenous polar bears, the personification of a hostile Arctic, are chewing on the corners of a Union Jack. There's shipwreck, there's a chaos of tumbled icebergs. At this particular moment in 1864, Landseer so well expresses dissatisfaction with the sheer uselessness of polar endeavour.
The disillusion of the 1860s was only a brief respite in a savage struggle between the Arctic wilderness and Victorian endeavour. Although the Northwest Passage was written off as a viable trade route, a new Arctic goal emerged, the North Pole. And from now on there was to be international competition, and there was little place for the large-scale British naval expeditions. The key to success lay in the Arctic itself. The Inuit have been part of the polar image from the beginning of European exploration. They had survived thousands of years in an Arctic environment where the British failed. It eventually dawned on the would-be polar explorers that the Inuit were more than just another exotic part of the flora and fauna. They and their use of the raw materials of the Arctic might be the key to conquest. And the new conquerors were not going to be the Brits. Norwegians like Roald Amundsen and Americans like Robert Peary were to be the new pioneers of the Arctic, and they adopted the ways of the Inuit to get to places no Brit had gone before. Peary was to take the Inuit example further than anyone else. He not only copied the Inuit, he co-opted them onto his expeditions.
Peary learned to travel on the ice with light sledges, with dogs. They'd figured out the problem of scurvy. Lead poisoning was no longer the issue. So Peary was able to by adapting the local Inuit way of living in the Arctic, was much more successful at achieving the farthest north.
On the 6th of April 1909, Peary had himself, his black servant Matthew Henson, and his Inuit team photographed at what he claimed to be the North Pole.
The discovery of the North Pole stands for the inevitable victory of courage, persistence, experience over all obstacles. Here is the cap and climax, the finish, the closing of the book on 400 years of history.
Such was the glory associated with reaching the pole that another rival explorer, Frederick Cook, also claimed to have got there first. The world's media was captivated by an acrimonious debate among rival claimants. Peary's claim prevailed at the time, but doubts remain.
Did Peary get to the North Pole? Does it really matter? He certainly got farther north than anybody had been. his claims of distances, the 40-odd kilometers a day that he traveled, or he must have traveled to actually get to the pole, it's maybe hard to believe, but, we weren't there. Maybe he got very lucky ice conditions in this variable ice conditions. And whether he really got to the pole or not, like I say, doesn't really matter. The Arctic Pole is kind of a virtual place. If you stand on the North Pole one day, the ice is moving, and if you don't even move yourself, you won't be at the North Pole the next day. So, whether he really made it or not, I don't think it really matters.
Peary certainly exploited his achievement to bring the Arctic into every American household. A whole plethora of merchandise was emblazoned with his picture and his polar success. So by the early 1900s, the Arctic had become embedded in the public consciousness. Its pole had been conquered, and its image had become a global marketing gimmick. Now its inhabitants were to become the heroes of the world's first ever cinema documentary.
It's a wonderful film, a beautiful technical piece of cinema. It's pivotal in the 1920s as marking a change of the way the Arctic wilderness is represented, from explorers' narratives in the 19th century through to a new forms, new technologies of image representation, the camera and the cinema, which gave quite wonderful and new and challenging images of the Arctic as a wilderness. It gets its world premiere in New York in 1922, and it really goes global. The image is seen in Australia, the film shows in London, in Indonesia, in India, in Africa. An image of the Canadian wilderness, albeit a romanticised one possibly, nevertheless an image of the Canadian wilderness, the Arctic wilderness, travels the world.
The film opened the eyes of millions of people to a distant region very remote from their own. Its release coincided with the discovery that, far from being an isolated wilderness, the Arctic was powerfully connected to the rest of the hemisphere. That connection was the ever-moving boundary between the massive cold air over the Arctic and the warmer body of air moving north from the equator.
You see, they discovered that we have on the northern hemisphere two big air masses. The subtropic air over the North Atlantic and the polar air over the polar regions. And these air masses touch each other at a border which is called the polar front.
The polar front is where the cold Arctic air meets warm air from the equator. Bad weather or cyclones form along the front. Find where the front is, and you can predict the weather.
If the polar front is north of us, we'll have good weather. If the polar front is in our area or even south of it, we'll get the cyclones.
As the Second World War drew closer, the Arctic became an area of vital strategic significance. On the oceans, the safe passage of Atlantic shipping would depend upon it. So would the success or failure of military campaigns on the mainland. All-year-round prediction necessitated all-year-round presence in the Arctic. After years of trials and tribulations, Europeans had finally developed the capacity to operate in the high north.
It was during the Second World War that the technology finally allowed southern individuals to actually be able to function in the north. It's the development of the steel-hulled vessel, the steam engine, and the airplane that meant for the first time ever that if you were a non-Inuit, you could actually have a reasonable hope of having transportation within the region, and it's within that context where we start seeing the ability to go forward. We see this, of course, from the German secret weather stations that they had in Greenland and in Labrador, where they were trying to ascertain what the weather was going to be in the Atlantic by having these weather stations in the Arctic.
Some of the secret weather stations had to be manned. In September 1944, Dr. Wilhelm Dieger and a team of young German meteorologists were secretly transported out to the remote Arctic archipelago of Svalbard to set up a station that would help forecast the weather in Western Europe. Dr. Dieger carried a film camera and was able to provide an extraordinary record of a year in the Arctic.
And the last station, 1944 to 45, was led by my father. You see, they were very well equipped because their status was higher than the submarine people. So highest status, they got everything, even in 1944. But they stressed the food with hunting, and they stretched the heating material with collecting and chopping up driftwood. He had to keep people busy. It was a bunch of 10 young men, I think between 18 and 21 years of age. And the official job, weather measuring, didn't take up all their time. We have a nice movie, it shows a beautiful scene of everybody disappearing in the steam bath. They had a sauna, and they claimed that was the best thing they had done there. You see, once a week on Friday, they had a steam bath in there.
Dieger's team did provide crucial forecasts that made a significant contribution to the German war effort, determining the timing of one famous battle in particular.
And one weather report in which my father was involved was in December 1944, the Battle of the Bulge in Belgium, the last German offensive on the Western Front, which was timed for a weather situation when the Allied planes were grounded because of drifting snow and fog.
After initial setbacks, the Allies eventually repulsed the German attacks and went on to force German surrender in 1945. Dieger and his team were shipped home, leaving behind a year's worth of sardine supplies. Elsewhere on Svalbard, other artifacts of war were left to rust. But from a military point of view, things were going to hot up rather than cool down. The region was now about to play a central part in the story of the superpower rivalry of the Cold War.
Here is a shadow that hangs above our world. Our fears, suspicions, nightmares of the future are all held in this picture of our shrunken Earth. From here we can see the main centers of human life. America, Europe, Asia, gathered in close, in range of one another. But whether this is to be a new link between us, or our last battlefield, depends not on the machines we fly, but on ourselves.
Those people are used to thinking about the Arctic as being a peripheral region. It's a little strip of white you see at the top of your map at School of the World, which is a Mercator projection. But when you look at a proper projection, the polar stereographic projection, you see that the Arctic is a little blob surrounded by all the advanced industrial countries of the world, North America, Europe, Russia. So the Arctic Ocean becomes geopolitically, it's the centre of things, it's not on the edge. During the Cold War, therefore, it became very, very important, and a huge amount was being spent on Arctic research, not because of the climatic implications, but because of the military implications.
From the end of January to the middle of March, the big delta country of Alaska is a snowbound wilderness, where the mercury can drop to 50 degrees below zero, and often does. Yet during these 3 months, your army held Exercise Moosehorn.
Oh, the weather outside is frightful, but the fire is so delightful. And since we've no place to go, let it snow, let it snow, let it snow. Man, it doesn't show signs of stopping, and I brought me some corn for popping.
It completely transforms itself. When the Soviets and the Americans have both figured out how to use their captured German rocket scientists to the best avail and develop what become known, of course, as ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, and you figure out how to put a nuclear warhead on it, the means of targeting is over the pole. So from 47 onward, the polar region becomes the major strategic transfer point as tensions continue to develop between the Soviets and the NATO countries, and in particularly the North Americans. You had to have a clearly working system that was going to alert you to the missiles. Ultimately, within North America, this becomes known as the DEW line, distant early warning. And it was basically a trigger point in which we would be told, oh, the nukes are coming, basically say goodbye to your family, we're just about to go kill Moscow.
All around the rim of the Arctic, small bands of indigenous people, including the Inuit, have been eking out a highly adapted livelihood for at least 5,000 years. The Cold War and the DEW line were to change this forever.
The DEW line completely transforms the economic situation of the Inuit across the entire North American Arctic. You had town settings where the major construction was occurring. And many of the Inuit who had traditionally only lived off the land started looking for employment and being introduced into the whole idea of a wage economy.
The unique traditional way of life for Inuit has disappeared in many respects. The part that we still retain is our cultural identity and our language. We've now come into communities, everybody goes to school, people go to work that can find a job. So you can see the transition that has taken place. It's very stark compared to the way it used to be in a very short time. I mean, there have never been such big changes, I don't think, in any culture that we've had to go through in the last 70 years. It's been tremendous.
Cold War and nuclear technology was to have another major impact on the North Polar region. As a wilderness, the Arctic is unique in that it exists both above and underneath the ice. The arms race led humankind to where no man had gone before.
Prior to the development of nuclear power and being able to build a small reactor, there was no way of going under the ice. You would never go under the ice in a conventional powered sub because there was always the danger that when you needed to surface to get air and recharge your batteries, you weren't going to break the ice. When the Americans and the Soviets figured out how to put a nuclear reactor in a submarine, that eliminated that issue.
By the end of the 1950s, the Americans were able to cross the Arctic under the ice. On March the 17th, 1959, the USS Skate was the first submarine to surface at the North Pole. On this voyage, the crew of the Skate had been able to navigate for 4,000 kilometers under the ice, surfacing only 10 times.
And as such, you saw nuclear deterrence being above the air in terms of bombers and ICBMs. You saw nuclear deterrence under the ice.
The sea under the Arctic became the scene for games of hide-and-seek, where submarine crews of each side listened for telltale sounds of each other's engines. Occasionally, scientists were allowed on board to measure the ice from below and take soundings of the seabed. Frequently, the sonar equipment picked up some of the wildlife from below.
A lot of the early understanding of whale behaviour in the Arctic came from recordings done from submarines, US and British nuclear subs, and that was partly because they needed to collect a library of sounds so that they could recognise natural sounds and separate them from artificial sounds made by other subs. There has been a project to map the migration of belugas under the ice, and it turns out that not only do they migrate around the edges of the Arctic, but sometimes they take quite long, dangerous voyages under the ice itself to get from between two feeding grounds, for instance in the Beaufort Sea. And this means they have to rely on being able to surface in linears to breed and horizontally if they can. So the tracking devices show them swimming under the ice and then taking very deep dives so they can use their sonar from a great depth to survey a bigger area of the surface and find where there's a hole.
But the wonders of Arctic wildlife were not only on the minds of scientists and submariners listening on hydrophones. Towards the end of the 80s, the importance of the polar environment was dawning on yet more powerful figures. It was here, in the Soviet Union's Arctic capital, that a dramatic new vision of the High North was to be outlined.
When Gorbachev comes forward, even before the Cold War ends, he comes forward in what is known as the Murmansk speech in 1987, in which he starts bringing forward his whole ideas of perestroika and glasnost, and says to the West, you know, we've got this commonality, we're Arctic nations, we should be cooperating in the Arctic.
Let the north of the globe, the Arctic, become a zone of peace. Let the North Pole be a pole of peace. We suggest that all interested states start talks on the limitation and scaling down of military activity in the North as a whole.
Now in 87, when he makes that speech, he basically gets dismissed. It's seen as a Soviet ploy. The Russians are just doing this for some form of protection of their northern fleet. But he also makes the very strong point that we need to come together on the environment.
We attach special importance to the cooperation of the northern countries in environmental protection. The urgency of this is obvious. It would be well to extend joint measures for protecting the marine environment of the entire oceanic and sea surface of the globe's north.
Although his speech was too early and possibly too utopian, Mikhail Gorbachev did set out a vision of an Arctic surrounded by a community of polar nations collaborating peacefully. Once demilitarized, the polar region was something that could bind hostile nations together.
He sets the stage. When it becomes evident by 1989 that in fact he is very serious, and then you start seeing events overtake him, you start seeing some of the other Arctic nations saying, hey, you know, maybe he was on to something. Well, when you get everyone together, they say, okay, well, what are we going to do besides talk? Well, let's start looking at environmental issues, nature issues. I mean, it can't be anything too terribly bad in the Arctic, but, let's actually give substance. Well, lo and behold, when they start looking, they discover that the image of a pristine environmental condition in the Arctic is completely wrong. That it is completely and utterly connected to almost all other environmental sections in the world. So pollution occurring in Pakistan ends up in the Arctic. For the Arctic is no longer understood as an isolated area, but in fact becomes the cornerstone of understanding environmental processes worldwide.
Parallel to the twists and turns of the Cold War, the media, particularly television, was bringing Arctic wildlife into the homes of millions. For many, this created an image of a remote and pristine ecosystem supporting large and exotic mammals. One animal above all became the emblem for the region.
A high slope above the sea ice is a relatively safe position for a bear's maternity den. Polar bears have between 1 and 3 cubs, or very occasionally 4. The twins are the most common. Since their birth under the snow around Christmas, they have suckled their mother's milk, but she has not fed since November, and having lived only on her fat reserves, is now extremely thin and hungry.
The filmmakers also recognized the fragility of the environment.
If disturbance were to reduce the number of seals, or industrial waste poison the Arctic Ocean, then polar bears would feel more strongly than most the sweeping changes that now face the North.
Just as the Arctic was emerging as a symbol for the vulnerability of the planet, another more insidious and ultimately overwhelming threat became apparent. Global temperatures have been rising, and the warming has been greatest in the Arctic. Each year the sea ice expands and contracts with the seasons.
Normally, the summertime minimum of ice is around 7.5 million square kilometers, which is about half the wintertime size. In the past decade, we've seen smaller and smaller amounts. 2005 set a big record with only 5 million square kilometers, so a couple of million square kilometers than the normal. 2007 was stunning to the Arctic scientists, where we reached a minimum of 4.1 million square kilometers. So 4.1, almost half the normal minimum size of ice in summer.
If the trend continues, then it's possible that the Arctic Ocean will be clear of ice in the summer by as early as 2030. The scientists are only confirming what the Inuit have been observing for years. Some are now seeing their homes sink into the thawing permafrost.
Now, with the change in the climate and this sea ice melting, the elders are no longer able to predict the weather, and they're very uncomfortable now about using their knowledge base because they themselves are questioning whether it's valid or not. There's pockets of ice that have melted, and hunters don't know that, and you hear about accidents quite a bit where snow machines have gone through the ice and people have gone, you know? These are things that would not normally have happened years ago.
But it's the Arctic's #1 icon that has now become a global emblem of climate change.
What's so powerful about the imagery of the Arctic is that if you start talking about climate change and the impacts of, say, New York or London, and you start saying, okay, in a few years, you're going to have to start dealing with a much higher tide line here. You start showing a picture or an icon such as the polar bear or the walrus, and you say, here it is in all its glory in the Arctic. Everybody can understand that right now. And you say in 20 years, 30 years, it will no longer be there. That is one of the most powerful images that I think people have in terms of the environmental distress that the Earth is now facing.
In just a few decades, the polar bear has been transformed from being a ferocious symbol of the Arctic that nearly ate Nelson, to the victim of mankind's abuse of the planet. Human-induced climate change is fundamentally altering the way the Arctic is perceived.
I think once upon a time, and thus we're talking only of the European perception here, once upon a time it was the harsh, threatening, but beautiful, very alien other place. So from there, I think we've now come to a point where it's now seen as a fragile, easy to destroy place.
Throughout the 19th century, the frozen north had been seen as the great ice barrier which enticed brave seamen on heroic voyages, many never to return. Now this 19th century obsession is literally melting away.
The Northwest Passage, now in 2007, has been open, clear of ice, for 2 years in a row, for an extended period, about 6 weeks. We don't have any record of it being like that so frequently in time. Franklin came through 1847. He found a bit of a route, but he was stopped. Now today we're sending ships through that area more and more frequently, but we still expect we'll be seeing years when there will be difficult ice conditions, well into the next few decades, until all the ice finally melts in the summertime.
The Arctic is more accessible than it's ever been. No longer the exclusive reserve for Inuit, explorers and camera crews. An open ocean in the north, surrounded by industrial nations, is a possibility that might be realized within the next 2 or 3 decades. There'll be losses as well as gains.
As in any other massive transformation, and I'll use the adjective massive very purposely, there are pros and cons. The cons are getting fairly understood. You will have the elimination of most of the major mammal species, particularly polar bears, walruses. You will have a major disruption of the traditional way of life for the Inuit and for other northern indigenous peoples. But by the same token, you are going to have opportunities. You are going to have economic opportunities in terms of the exploitation of natural resources, oil, gas, and diamonds. You are going to have the ability to have new transportation routes. We're not entirely sure where it is going, but it is going to be massive.
Some estimates suggest that as much as 20% of the world's oil and gas reserves may be found beneath the polar seabed. Discoveries are being made of yet more gold, diamonds and tungsten. Environmental consequences will be inevitable as exploration gets underway. There is also the prospect of an international land grab and disputes over sovereignty. 2 centuries ago, John Barrow of the British Admiralty was spurred into action by the prospect of Russian domination of the Polar Sea. History seems to be repeating itself.
And it continues to be a stage for geopolitical contests. Just in 2007, the flamboyant Russian explorer Artur Chalingorov planting a flag on the sea floors, 4,000 metres below the North Pole, below the sea ice, as a gesture of Russian sovereignty.
The melting Arctic is now between two visions. Will it become the scene of peaceful collaboration as Mikhail Gorbachev proposed in 1987? Or will it return to being the scene of armed hostility that characterized the Cold War?
We are literally on a crossroad. We have a possibility of seeing true international cooperation develop in the North. Unfortunately, there are also forces that are coming to the forefront that are suggesting that nations may in fact start looking to their own interests. We have the choice at this point in time in terms of how we respond to this transformation, but it's at this point is not entirely clear which of the two we are in fact going to follow.
It's now 190 years since Mary Shelley opened her story of Frankenstein with the idealistic imaginings of a young explorer.
I feel a cold northern breeze play upon my cheeks, which braces my nerves and fills me with delight. I try in vain to be persuaded that the pole is the seat of frost and desolation. It ever presents itself to my imagination as a region of beauty and delight. I shall satiate my ardent curiosity the sight of a part of the world never before visited, and may tread a land never before imprinted by the foot of man.
This is now a landscape where the imprint of humankind is so powerful that we are fundamentally altering its appearance and its ecology. But it is still within our power to ensure that, at least in part, the Arctic remains a wilderness, a place of wild beasts, and a region of beauty and delight.
Stay with us here on BBC 4. There's another chance to catch Friday's Music Night programmes coming up next, kicking off with the gloriously sparkly Joy of Disco.